Hello and welcome, everybody, to another episode of Coaching from the Heart. We are back today with a live show. It's wonderful to be back. And joining me, as always, is my good friend, colleague, and co-host, Harold Feddersen. Hey, Harold.
Hi, Tyler.
Thanks for joining me again, as always. It's good to be back after I've been kind of on and off the last couple weeks, but we're back, and today's topic for the show is self and self-image. And that might sound like gibberish to you, so we're gonna dive into what the heck we mean by that here in a minute. But oh, my Siri just went off. Sorry about that, everybody. This is live radio, so anything can happen. But before we jump into the topic at hand, I just want to tell people where they can find us both. As Harold and I are both professional transformative coaches, we walk with people both individually and in groups to transform their lives. And so if you're interested in that, you can find me, Tyler, at www.coachtylerthurman.blogspot.com, and find all my contact information there. Lots of fun links and free videos and articles and all sorts of cool stuff. So look me up there. And Harold, where can everyone find you?
I can be found at www.haroldfeddersen.ca.
Fantastic. And I believe that is also now, you can just find those links at the bottom of the video on YouTube. So, all right, let's jump into it. Harold, you're going to set the table for the topic today, as we decided 5 seconds before the show. So
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to hearing what we're going to be talking about.
Here where spontaneously we're going to be going.
It's another live thing. So
Yeah. Okay, so I think there are a couple different directions we could go. Maybe we'll just start with so what are the two things? So there's self and self-image, not versus self-image. These are not two things that are competing against each other, but they're two coexisting things. So the self, now let's start with self-image. That's probably easier.
Yeah.
So self-image is who we believe we are, how we believe others perceive us, and generally the patterns or conditions that we have that interact with the world at large.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like me. My self-image is Harold Feddersen, coach teacher. You're the great Tyler Thurman.
Yeah, another word, and I'm sorry to jump in, but another word we might use is just our identity, right? Who we identify ourselves as. And that's made up of a bunch of different stuff, right? Our thinking, our behavior, our memory. It's mostly thinking, but because an image suggests something in the mind, right? An image in the mind of who we think we are. So yeah, go ahead. Back to you.
So that's the self-image aspect of it. And then the self part is the one that's a little bit trickier to talk about, because we can just use fancy labels. But one thing I was thinking would be an interesting way to enter into this conversation is Zen koans. Are you familiar with? I don't know. You probably are.
It sounds like gibberish to me. So explain away.
So a koan is is used in the Zen tradition, and a koan is either a short question, statement, or story that is designed to evoke or awaken an aspect of your being that is more dormant. So normally, like the question, one of the famous koans is, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" And So immediately our thinking mind is like, oh, what would, and you probably grab your hand, you're like, what does that sound like, because your thinking mind wants to take it on and solve it as though it is an answerable problem.
Yeah.
But in the Zen tradition, the whole point of it is to awaken the being that exists prior to the whole thought structure. And one of the koans that sort of brings me into the arena that we're in about the self is what was the appearance of your face before your parents were born? And so there's a moment just before there's just this moment where we're in this place where our thinking mind doesn't get it, but something else almost comes alive in us. Something else, some form of curiosity almost bubbles to the surface about what that is. And so I think that's one way to look at what the self is in the self and self-image.
Harold, I really like what you're saying there, because I think what you're speaking to is sort of before. It's almost like it's before the self concept, because we've got all this sort of prefabbed ideas and notions and like you said, behaviors that we're just kind of on autopilot. We're used to thinking about ourselves in a certain way, thinking about the world in a certain way, beliefs and values and all that. It's almost like just back it up, right? Just before all of that. It's kind of funny because I've never really thought of it in that way. But what's pop into my head is when you wake up in the morning, right? Before you remember who you are and where you are, right? This person that, for me, it's this person that is Tyler, this separate individual in the world. What's there before that? What's in that space? And I like the word you're using there, being, as kind of a synonym for self, right? That it's something that's it just is. It's just true. It's just, and I like the dormancy too. It's kind of lying dormant for most of us, a lot of the time, and yeah.
That space between sleep and what we call wake, that is a really beautiful threshold to become familiar with, because you can as you play with it, because for most of my life it was either sleep or bang, I'm awake, my brain is just going, and off we are to the races. But as I've practice this stuff that we talk about all the time, that threshold has become much larger, and you actually, there's so much space in there where you can play, where you really don't. There's you're waking, but you haven't formed. You haven't formed everything yet, and the brain hasn't just clicked into gear, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, you haven't started on the track of the. It's
To-do
almost
list.
it's almost like there's this tape that we got to push play in the morning. It's the Tyler loop or the Harold cassette, right? And then you sort of, we're kind of doing a lot of sleepwalking throughout the day.
Because we're on this autopilot.
We're on this autopilot that is.
We're living to-do list.
That is a wonderful representation of the self-image, right? That's basically what that is. And I think maybe we could back this conversation up a tiny bit to the self-image part, because it's tricky, because not most people, but probably a lot of people have never considered that their self-image is not their self.
Right.
Right. So I think we jumped into this self, like, oh, there's this beautiful space and this thing that we can't talk about because words don't do it justice, and yada yada yada. Right. It's the kind of thing you and I talk about a lot on this show, and just between us, off air too. But I think a lot of people they're probably scratching their head going, wait, so the ideas I have about myself and the thinking and the everything that goes with that, that's not necessarily me. You know, that's kind of there's a bit of a leap there, I think. So you know, when I first kind of came across that, had some insights about that, you know, some experiences of the self, you know, in the way that we're talking about it with a capital S, as the Course in Miracles would put it. That was kind of a big thing for me, you know, to be able to have that even be a distinction, right? That maybe I'm not who I think I am, right? Maybe there's more to me, or there's more to this thing called life, or there's just something behind the scenes that I wasn't previously aware of. That because for most people, most of the time, autopilot that's just what we know. That's what we think is reality. That's true. And in fairness, it's true for you whenever you're in it, that's your experience. But there's something else that, you know, that we're referring to as the self. There's something, it's just different. There's something different than who we think we are. And that can be, even if you just stop there, that can be a huge insight in my experience. Because there's all these ideas that we have about ourselves that aren't they aren't very nice, to put it simply. We're not very kind in how we think about ourselves typically, and so we've got a very harsh inner dialogue that can really be an obstacle to us living a more wonderful life, having a more beautiful experience of life. And so I just wanted to go back to that, to the core distinction as identifying that there is a distinction there. Yeah, go ahead, Harold.
And I think your point there is important too, because most of our self-image, most of our inner dialogue self-image is negative.
Sure, you
know?
absolutely, yeah.
And then what's interesting is to watch how we create a false confidence by saying the opposite.
Right.
So we bounce back and forth between these two, you know, self-deprecating and then like I always think of it like a balloon. You know, like you fill up the balloon and then you squeak out the balloon, you fill up the balloon, and it's just this constant like accordion movement.
Yeah.
Up and in and out, you know, beat yourself up, pick yourself out, beat yourself down, pick yourself up. And there's another option altogether, which is
right.
just if you're going to speak about yourself, just speak about the facts of yourself. You know, like you and I, just before the show started, you know, one of our self-image things is that you and I, we like to take things we're just like relaxed and slow. Like that's just part of our self-image thing. And there's no sort of judgment about it, although we were having a good laugh.
Which,
you know,
I'm sure none of our viewers notice that we like to, you know, take our time laying out our ideas and our experiences. Nobody knows what you're talking about, Harold.
No. So it's interesting to know that, you know, it doesn't have to be a beat up or a cheerleader, you know?
Sure.
Like it doesn't have to be those two. It can just be this thing like, oh yeah, I have this thing where I always, you know, yell at people who cut me off in traffic or whatever.
It doesn't have to be this thing that we demonize, which is I think that's what you're talking about. It's this negative. Oftentimes, it's this negative thing, and then we we try to take that thing that is the self-image, and then it just becomes a positive thing, but it's still the self-image, right? It's like what you're saying, it's not just flipping the self-image and make it's something else entirely. And I believe that's what you're pointing to is and that's kind of the path it tends to take. I think that was the path that my sort of evolution in discovering that was, oh, I'll just you know, I'll not hate myself anymore. I'll not say naughty things about myself. I'll prop myself up, right? I'll kind of have all this positive thinking laid over top, and it's very I think it was potentially useful in me seeing past all of it, but so long as you kind of know that there's something beyond even that, there's something. One of the ways that's coming to mind as far as an analogy for understanding it without making it a big thing, like making it into something I've got to get rid of or demonize. It's kind of what we do with the ego, right? It's the enemy of spirit or something like that, right? And that just doesn't help at all. Right? That doesn't do us any good. And that's to think about it in terms of language, right? So language is sort of, I talk about it as symbols of symbols, right? So if you kind of think about the mind, there's some kind of bottom floor truth to it. We don't really know what it is, can't talk about it. You could probably have an experience of it. And then there's sort of things that, activity in the mind, right? Sometimes we talk about them as images, right? We have images in the mind, things that we think about. And then we put language to those. And language, if you think about it in those terms, it's 2 steps removed from. So there's language, and then there's the concept or the image or the idea that the language is based on, and then there's the actual truth, right? So that's all that the self-image is. It's just a way for us to think about the self. The only problem with that is it's usually not a reflection of that truer self. But in kind of that, I know that's very analytical. It's probably going to make everyone go up in their mind and start analyzing things. But if you can get away from that and just see, all of my self-images is just, it's this kind of step removed. It's just an idea, right? It's just this concept. That's another word I use sometimes to talk about the self-image, is the self-concept, the concept we have about ourselves. It's just an idea in the mind. And ideas can actually be inaccurate. Not to say our experience of them is wrong or bad or anything like that, because it's not. That's not true. But my experience is there's some kind of deeper, essential self that is, at least my experience of it is it's this beautiful thing. It's not a thing, right? It's this. It's very difficult to put words to it, right? Because words are removed from it. So it's challenging. We'll do the best we can, right, with the tools we've got. So that's all it is. We don't have to demonize it. We don't have to make it into the enemy. That's why Harold and I decided not to call it self versus self-image, which sort of, like, I think you already mentioned that, Harold. It sort of just brings to mind the idea of these battling things. It's almost like there are different levels And it's the self-image can be, I think it can be a representation of the self, but other times it can be an inaccurate representation as well. But it's not, it's something different. So I'm just stepping off my little intellectual lecture. Harold, save me, save me.
Okay. I got a couple things I want to say now.
Fantastic.
One way to approach this that actually is the way I generally approach it is you are not your story.
Thank you for that. That's a beautiful way of talking about it.
Most people believe that the character in the story of their life is what they are, and that the story is the thing that's sort of the foundation of their being.
Gotcha.
And that's not true, of course. That's not true because you exist prior to the story, and this character in the story has a finish to it. And yet there's something, if you start to see the patterns of the way you behave in the world, or the patterns of the character of your story, you can start to see, like, you can actually observe from inside of yourself. You can watch yourself acting out in a certain way, in a certain pattern, a certain thought structure, certain conversation, where you know exactly how this conversation is going to go. And when there's that sort of predictability to it, you know that you're actually once removed from the story, which means you actually aren't the story. If you're observing the story happening, you're something other than the story. A good way I like to point it out is it brings me back to our anger conversation, which was, if people haven't watched that show, they should. That was like a really good one. They're all good, but
sure.
You know, when you're completely taken by anger, you're so angry that all of your whole everything is just anger. You're just anger. And then there comes a point where you actually pull back enough to where you say, I am really angry. So there's actually two things now. There's the emotion of anger, and then there's the you that can see, wow, I'm really angry. So once you have those two, you automatically have to question, because the anger is the story. And so if you step back now and you're looking and you're like, wow, I'm really angry, already you're a different place. The story, the character is still angry, but now there's what we're calling self today is one step removed and is now observing the self-image, which is angry.
Right.
So it appears as though there are two things there. And in one sense, there really is two things. In one sense, there are two things there.
Yeah.
In another sense, there isn't. But I think that's a helpful distinction as well, or framework.
Yeah, I think so. I think just thinking about that kind of engenders to me, there's a storyteller, right? If there's a story, well, where did the story come from? Right? Because you kind of think of stories as fiction, right? Like a story is, I'm telling a story, right? It's it can be entertaining, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not necessarily true, right? And somebody, another way that a lot of people have probably heard this talked about is the observer, right? And I talk about it as being a decision-making mind. That's a concept that comes from A Course in Miracles. But it's the same thing as an observer. There's this character of us, the self-image, this story. The story of you is how one of my old coaches, Steve Chandler, used to talk about it. The story of you. Which I really just love that language. It's kind of like, what? The story of me? There's no story of me. There's just me. Well, there is a story, and we're telling it. But we're not just telling it, we're believing in it. We're identifying with it. And that it's not a problem, it's not bad, but it can be an obstacle to realizing that's not all there is. Um, but yeah, there's just this, if we're not the anger, then we're something else, right? If we're not the story, maybe we're the storyteller. If we're, you know, there's all sorts of ways. What was the word or the term you used about the Zen?
The koan?
Kind of, it's like a teaching story almost, right? Like
It's
yeah.
It's an invitation into seeing or being in the world in a different way.
Right, right. There's all sorts of those different kinds of ways of talking about this thing because it's sort of fundamental to the human experience, right? This is, for lack of a better term, we're going deep here, psychologically. but in another way, it's really simple, right?
It's so simple.
It's so simple. It's not really complex. The story itself can be and often is complex, right? But the idea behind it is not. There's really just, because everything in our life is part of the story for the most part. Um, you know, I'm Tyler the coach, right? That's my story. That's sometimes how I identify myself. Married, no children. That's another thing I identify as part of me. Um, living in New Mexico, right? That's another part of my identity. But on another level, that's not who I am. And that's not who you are, whoever you are out there listening or watching. There's more to us than that. And I think most people, if you slow down for a minute or two, we kind of intuitively know that. We can kind of get in touch with, you know what? I'm not my job. That's a game I used to play, actually. Okay. Are you, I think I learned this from Michael Neal, one of my favorite coaches and people. Is the what are you game, right? Okay. Am I my finger? Well, if you lost your finger, would you still be there, right? Am I my job, right? Well, I don't think so, right? It's easy to change jobs, but we often kind of intuitively think, oh, well, I've changed jobs, but there's still an I there that changed jobs. There's something that didn't change. There's, my relationship. There's all these different things that are part of our story that we identify with that it's just not the whole shebang, right there, because they're very fluid, they're very changing, and there's something, not to say the self isn't changing, the essential self, but there's something more foundational. There's something more just beyond that. And then it gets tricky, right? Because you start to say, am I my body? Well, I don't know, right? Am I my brain? Right? Am I my mind? Is the mind the same as the brain? I don't know. It's pretty easy to see, like, if my arm gets chopped off, well, I'm not my arm. But am I my body? I don't know. Like, I think, Harold, you and I talk sometimes. The You know, a lot of people have probably heard the idea that our body's sort of completely different cellularly in like 7 years. It's all different cells, all different. Um,
Completely replaced every 7 years.
yeah, so the actual physical substance isn't the same, but we don't think. We still kind of have this intuition that something has carried over, right? And it's just this, for me, it's this beautiful exploration because we don't have the answer. Like with our language, right? I'm not saying you and I, Harold, haven't had experiences that are closer to the truth. Um, but it's this beautiful exploration of, well, maybe there's more to me than I thought. You know, maybe there's this beautiful thing underneath this horrible self-dialogue, right? Because it's nasty. I just had a conversation with a client not too long ago, I think last week maybe, and we were talking about inner dialogue, right? And usually it's kind of unconscious. We don't notice it very much. And we started to pull it out a little bit. And I was like, if you just think about, let's just think about the way that you talk to yourself or to think about yourself. For most people, most of the time, when we identify just how nasty that is and can be, and you think about, well, you wouldn't talk to your worst enemy that way. But we talk to ourselves all day. This is self-deprecating, just awful, like, oh, you worthless piece of, blah, 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 blah. And it goes on, and it's just this, it's nasty, man. And it's so unkind. And my experience is that's not us. That's not us. That's how we think about ourselves a lot without knowing it, in fairness. But there's something deeper. There's something else more beautiful, more fundamental. Harold, you're smiling, so I want everybody else to see your smile. So
That's funny.
So you better start talking.
One of the ways to enter into this is sort of going back to that experience where we are anger, and then we notice that we even can say, I am angry.
Right.
And the question is, what is occurring there? And the language part of it is there's an awareness. Your awareness is we would generally say, I am becoming aware that there is anger here. But what's really happening is awareness is becoming aware of the anger. Awareness is perceiving the anger. Kind of like awareness notices the flower. Awareness notices the lamp.
Yeah, sure.
Awareness. So when we enter into this space a little deeper, we begin to recognize that awareness is the one that is seeing. And there's not like a thing, there's not like an I that's aware of, because as soon as there's an I, then there's two of us. Eventually we see that it's just awareness is seeing. So language-wise, for me, it's easiest to put it in that sense. Like when you want to know what you are awareness.
Right.
There does need to be a facility with noticing, your thoughts and such, because we often believe that we're our thoughts.
Sure.
But the same thing happens, for anyone who meditates for any kind of. You can meditate for 1 minute and you'll see it's like, wow, there's a lot of thoughts going on. So if you notice the thoughts, it's like, what is that? That's awareness seeing the thoughts. It's not I am seeing the thoughts, because normally we associate I think this, I think that. So the I is actually tagged onto the thought. Or I am angry, I is tagged onto the anger. But there's an awareness that comes from the silence that we find deep within that sees what's happening. And I think that's the sort of the deepest language I have currently for that.
Yeah, and like we talked about, it's tricky, right? It's tricky to speak about.
Because we don't want this to be a head conversation. Like it comes, you're introduced to it from listening, and you're like, oh, well, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that before.
Right, and then and then suddenly you have an experience, and you're like, oh, that wasn't there when I was analyzing it. Right.
Yeah. Because the whole purpose of what we do, you and I think it is, the whole purpose of what we do is to invite people to find out if this is true in their own experience.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you said that, because that's a disclaimer in my coaching, actually. I'm like, look, don't take my word for this. I tell that to people, everyone I work with, in fact. Say, please, I plead with people, don't take me at my word. Because words are all I've got as far as in this dualistic world for communication. There's probably some other stuff going on, but as far as communication goes, I'm using language, but I'm saying, please don't stop there. I think, I can't remember if it was you and I, Harold, but I was having the conversation with somebody, you can remind me if it was you, about the pointing. You can point to a tree, and someone's either going to look at the tree or they're going to look at your finger. Right?
Oh yeah, that was the Zen, the pointing at the moon, and the Zen master points at the moon, and all the students look at the finger.
Right. So that's the analysis, right? Is we stop at the finger, and we say, "Oh yes, the tree. Oh yes, I see what you mean." But you haven't quite yet, right? It's there to see, but we stop at taking people at their word. That's one of the problems with sort of being a public figure, right? I wouldn't call myself a public figure, but I guess technically we are, because we're on video on YouTube, right? But we take people at their word, right? We say, oh yeah, and we kind of have this intuition about, oh yeah, that's true. I think that's true, is what we're saying. There's kind of this vague recognition, but it's still kind of in the realm of the brain, that intellect. And we haven't yet seen it for ourselves, which that's where all the value lies. So I probably just sidestepped this whole conversation, but I'll bring it back to you, Harold. I wrangled it away from you. So,
so we were on the practice checking this stuff out for yourself, because for me, when in my 20s, I thought I knew it all because I had it in my head.
Sure.
It's like, well, I know that, blah, 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 blah. And, there's all this false confidence that we had talked about earlier. And, the Jehovah's Witnesses would come to my front door to convert me, and I'd be like, I'm going to convert them. And, it was this head thing between the two of us, these two thought structures.
It was this verses, right?
Yeah. But that has no value. As you and I know, transformation occurs when we go to the inside and then bring it out, as opposed to just collecting information and holding it in our thoughts.
It's experiential.
Yeah. You got to feel into this stuff.
And have you ever been, sorry, I jumped in. I was just going to say, have you ever been in that space where it's like, so-and-so says this and so-and-so says that, because we've read all these books, right? And we've gone to all these seminars and heard all these wonderful speakers, and we say, oh, well, Wayne Dyer says this, and the Course in Miracles says this, and all these, wonderful Hay House. A lot of people are probably familiar with Hay House. So all these wonderful authors that have all these wonderful messages, and sort of their own brand of truth, right? And it's just different language for the same thing a lot of times. And we're caught up on the form. You're caught up on what they're saying and what we're sort of hearing them say, but we've never actually looked for ourselves. Right? So I say that because I remember I was in that space for a time, probably in my 20s too, Harold, even though mine weren't.
Yours weren't that long ago.
But I just remember getting in that space, and that was a space of self-righteousness. And you and I, Harold, have talked about that quite a bit on this show. And looking back on that I'm not to say I don't get in that space sometimes still. Of course I do. Of course I get, just to let people know, right? That's always going to be there for the most part. It lessens for sure. But
eventually it'll go.
Yeah, but when you're in that space, just notice that it's not a very nice place, right? It's not bad. It's not bad. It's not sinful. It's not evil. But it's so disconnecting. Yeah, friction.
Friction based.
It's like I like you use the example of the converting, right? It's so versus. It's so me versus them. That's not who we really are, right? My experience is there's this unity, there's this wholeness. I think we've talked about quite a bit before in other shows. That's what it feels like. It doesn't. It feels like the opposite of the friction. Basically, there's no pushback. There's peace. For me, peace. The word is peace, right? There's peace in my heart and in my mind. That conflict just isn't there. And so that's one of the ways you can kind of tell, and maybe you have seen it, maybe you've experienced it plenty and you're just in the moment. You know what? I'm not seeing it. You know what? I've stepped away from myself for a moment. And that's okay. We do it. That's what we do.
And I can hear some of our listenership or viewership asking the question, how do we get to that?
How, Harold? Please tell me how to get there.
Let's reveal truth key number 3. No, I don't know.
The secret to success.
Yeah.
Number 1734.
That goes all the way back to our first show. I think
the
humor in that.
I believe it does. Yes, that's funny.
So the way that it happens is through disidentifying with the self-image as what you are.
Yeah.
The more you see that the self-image, the Harold Feddersen story, the more that you see that this is just this sort of almost character thing that's happening.
It's this fiction.
This thing, yeah. The more we see that we're not our thoughts, like somebody recently, I was having a conversation, and I said, do you believe that Santa Claus is real? And of course not. They said, of course not. When you were 8, that was truth. All of your thoughts, that was a truth so deep, so pure.
Yeah.
And then when you're 15, That was replaced. There's a whole new absolute truth. In your 20s, absolute truth. 30s, absolute truth. 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. All the way through, there are these sort of absolute truths, if you will, if we stay believing that our thoughts are somehow the truth of the reality we live in.
Yeah, that's a good way of talking about it.
So the more we disidentify from our thoughts, the more we can sort of separate from that thought structure, the more we begin to actually soften in the whole thought structure of everything, including other people's thoughts.
Yeah, yeah.
So that other people's opinions of us actually don't affect us in the way that they did before, because now it's like, oh yeah, that's a thought. Yeah, I have lots of thoughts. I know they're not serious. And one of the games I used to play, I still do, but I played a lot in my 20s, was to play the opposite thought. So if I'm like, well, I believe this, be like, well, then see if you can convince yourself. It's kind of an inner debate team.
Sure.
Where you try and prove both sides. And the value in that is just to prove that neither side is sort of the truth. Both are just really strong evidence-based opinions
It's
about
not,
whatever.
yeah, it's not solid. In other words, it's
Mm-hmm.
it's because it feels solid when you're in
So it
when you're in
feels
that
so
belief.
real.
And I love that you gave that sort of decade, laying out the decades, right? Because when you're in that decade, that's the only decade.
Oh man, that's this is the
Because we
absolute.
have amnesia to the previous decade, right? And we're like, and if someone brings it up, it's like, no, that's not a thing.
I was confused back then. I
Yeah,
was
like
just a kid.
it was just a kid. But we fail to sort of admit to ourselves that was real for us then. That was as real as it got, right? But yeah. I mean, I love what you're saying because it's one of the ways that I talk about sometimes is just the we're always going to have thinking, but our relationship to thought itself shifts, right? It's because, like you said, it's that we go from this is who I am to this. It's not quite that solid anymore. This is more of it's a thought system, right? And thought systems can change. They're pretty fluid, in fact. Right? Now, they don't always change quickly if we're pretty dead set on something, but um, even something seemingly as solid as memories, right? They're constantly evolving because every time you go back to a memory, you go back from somewhere else. You're going back from not the same place where you started having that memory. Um, and so there's all these things to do with thought in the mind that just seem solid. And so it's really nothing to do with getting rid of the thinking or changing the thinking as far as our entry point, right? Because you asked the question how, right, Harold? Um, it's more about some kind of seeing, right? I'm seeing this isn't what I thought it was, right? My thinking isn't what I thought it was. This experience of life, of myself as my self-image, the story of me, it's just, it's not, it's not as solid as we thought. It's not this real thing. It's just a thought system that can and does change. And a lot of people, they want to stop there and say, okay. In fact, that's what NLP was when I was in my training for neuro-linguistic programming. It was all about, okay, our reality it's all made up. This is actually one of the sayings, right? It's all made up, so let's make up good stuff. I have since come to see, this is just my understanding, right? You don't have to take it as gospel, but I've since come to see that's not entirely true, because there's something else making up the stuff. There's this observer, there's this storyteller, there's this decision-making mind. There's this, okay, if I'm not my thinking, I'm still kind of experiencing my thinking. Who's the one experiencing my thinking? Again, I'm sorry to get intellectual like that. Um, but it's just there's something else, and it's for me, it's been an exploration. It's not been this rigid 7-step process, right? It's this exploration, and the exploration itself has evolved, right? The you could call it an investigation, I guess, right? Into the self, right? Versus self-image and self-image. Um, but yeah, it's, we joke. It's this, oh, here, we'll give you the 7-step process, but it's, you know, it always looks different to me whenever I ask that question. Well, how do you get there? It looks different each time to me, which tells me um, I, I don't have a good enough answer to really answer that question, um, which maybe tells me that the question itself isn't that always that helpful, right? Um, it's more in the seeing than the doing, but then we make that into a doing, and so it's tough. It's tough to talk about, but it's there to see. So really, all it takes is us wanting to look. And you'll find it, right? Like if I'm pointing to a tree and there's actually a tree there to be seen, that's another whole philosophical debate, right? But if there's actually a tree there to be seen, it's not that hard to see it once you look. But we're looking all over the place. If you're looking at my hand, it's going to be very confusing. Because, sometimes I'm pointing at different angles, different directions, using different language. So from that perspective, it's tough. But my best response to that is, if you want to see it, you'll look. And because there is actually something to see, not with the body's eyes, not this physical thing. It's kind of an inner sight. Because there's something actually there to see, you'll see it. Sometimes you just got to wade through the noise, I think is kind of what you're pointing to, Harold, disidentifying with all that chatter, which is the story, of us.
Mm-hmm. I read a poem by Dorothy Hunt on one of our previous shows. Pieces.
That was beautiful.
Peace is this moment. And she has an interesting exercise that she does with people where everybody calms down for a bit. So you take some deep breaths, and then she says, without the aid of memory, who are you? No, without the aid of memory, what is your name? Without the aid of memory, who were your parents? Without the aid of memory, who are you? And I played this little game with her. She was on the internet, so it wasn't, we weren't actually playing together, but
yeah.
It's you get to enter that space that I talked about right at the beginning. That happens with the Zen koan. Without the aid of memory, What is my name? And there's this space where there isn't like an answer, but there's a space where there's a knowing that something is present. There is a presence, there's a being, there's an awareness of something. So prior to the label, something exists prior to the label. Krishnamurti has a beautiful saying about some story about a boy, and man points at the bird, and the boy looks up, and the man says, "That's a bird." And Krishnamurti says, the moment you say to the boy, "That is a bird," that boy will never see that being again.
Right.
Because now the boy will only see the label.
So the image, yep.
The self-image. So it's the same with us. And what Dorothy Hunt does in that video, it's on YouTube somewhere, is you get the real sense of that. And hopefully, you got it just from that little thing there. You get the sense of presence without a label. Just before the label comes, there is that, then you're touching into the self of what we're talking about.
Or maybe being without thought, right? Is there something there? So I think sometimes I've heard of meditation practices where it's like the goal, at least, is look between your thoughts. Who would I be without those memories, those thoughts? That's a beautiful entry point into this conversation, into this inquiry, because it's funny, Harold, in our culture, the idea of waking up without a memory is terrifying to us, right? Things like Alzheimer's, right? Where I think one of the reasons that is so scary is because we see people who that is thrust upon them, and they fight it like hell, right? And I'm not trying to say that's wrong or that's bad. That's understandable, right? But just consider the possibility that to be in the moment and to forget who you think you are could be the best thing that's ever happened to you. Could be this beautiful experience. But if it's sort of thrust upon you and you're like the most identified with your self-image, that's going to be a really scary thing, right? But if you sort of enter into this inquiry willingly, this exploration willingly, there's something beautiful to see. There's something beautiful to experience, just beyond who we think we are, who we think. And I really like that exercise, Harold. I've not heard that, but I'm gonna have to check that out.
Mm-hmm.
So I realize we're coming to the end of our show, everybody. And Harold, it's become a tradition. So I can see the excitement brimming, and you are our parting shot expert. So I'm gonna let you sign us off as best you can.
Okay. So one of the things to play with is the stickiness of thoughts. One thing you'll notice right out of the gates is some thoughts are really sticky and some thoughts are not, right? What's the best kind of flavor of ice cream? Chocolate today, Oreo tomorrow. Not that sticky. Not that sticky. There are some thoughts that are really sticky. We are really adhered to. And that space between anger and I am angry is zero. There's no space. So the stickiness between the thought and the identification is tight. And noticing that, beginning to notice which thoughts are really, really sticky for you is the gateway or the invitation into creating a little space and opening that up and softening that identification. And as we practice undoing the glue of those that we've got attached to those thoughts, all sorts of things begin to soften, and all of our interaction with the world begins to shift, because we're no longer stuck to this thought or these bunch of thoughts, which we then use kind of like armor to enter the world. And they start to soften and they start to fall away. And then we interact with the world differently. And then all of a sudden, the entire universe interacts with us in a new way as well. And a complete transformation happens. And it's natural. It's inevitable in some sense.
Yeah.
And it can be very scary. But as we practice maybe with the softer, the less sticky ones, that cookies are actually better than muffins. Start with something
It's
that's a little
true.
sticky,
It's
a
true.
little little sticky, but not super sticky. And soften into that and just get a feel for what it actually feels like to soften. So you actually get the felt sense. You'll feel it in your body. You'll just feel this softening and this opening happening. And just practice and practice and practice and just play with it. And notice when you're interacting with people how sometimes, so all of a sudden everything's really sticky and you're on one side and they're on the other side and you're like, oh yeah. And just practice noticing that, and then practice getting into it, and practice softening, and practice letting go, and then practice allowing them to be firmly attached to their thought and opinion, and you softly just being totally okay with them having that opinion, because you know from your own experience that you are not your thoughts. Therefore, the person you're interacting with is not their thoughts either, whether they have experienced that or not. So it gives you the invitation to sort of speak to them through their own thought structure and meet them in a deeper place, in a different and deeper way.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, Harold. And that for me, that creates a space of compassion just naturally, right? When we see, oh, they're in their head, they're identifying with those sticky thoughts. And I know what that's like. I know what that's like. And that's then we can
And
meet
what
them. Yeah, go ahead.
and what did I need when I was stuck to my thought? Did I need someone hitting me in my thought? No,
Yeah,
I just needed a place where it was okay for you to be with that thought.
right.
It's just
Yeah,
okay. Yeah, that's fine.
yeah, exactly. Fantastic. Thank you for that. Okay, so with that, that's going to conclude our show today. But just as a reminder to everybody, where they can find, if you enjoyed this conversation, we're here most weeks. And so tune in again next week. But if you enjoyed this conversation, go listen to some of the past ones. And if it occurs to you to go deeper, you know what? I'd like to have a conversation with one of these guys. See what, where they could possibly lead me, what they could open up for me. Then reach out to us. We're happy to hear from you. We're happy to have a conversation, and we do it professionally. We walk with people to sort of open up a space where we can enter the self with a capital S. Or at least let go of the self-image. so with that, thank you everybody for tuning in. We love all your thoughts and supports. Please send us questions, show topics, and we're happy to entertain those. And until next time. with all the love that's already in your heart and your mind. We'll see you next time.